Business and Organized Labor, 1860 to 1900. These are our core objectives for Chapter 16. Please make sure that you review them as you are reading the chapter. After the Civil War, we see a huge increase in industrialization across the United States. And actually, the industrialization began during the war and really as a result of the war. But when we look at the reasons for industrialization, what we have to look at really is what came together in the latter part of the 19th century, the 1800s, to allow for the U.S. to become a industrialized country, one of the largest industrialized countries in the world. And so when we look at this, we really identify 7 reasons for industrialization in the latter 19th century. And the first one of these is natural resources. The United States is very lucky in that we have an abundant amount of natural resources. Lumber, mineral resources, great agricultural land. And so these, of course, are necessary items that you must have in order to become industrialized. A second thing that comes about for industrialization is capital. This is simply money. There was a great deal of capital that came into America really as a result of the gold discoveries out west, beginning shortly before the American Civil War. If we look at the California gold rush in the 1840s, and then we move into gold rushes in Colorado and Nevada in the 1850s and 60s. And so this capital, this money, can be parlayed into building big businesses. A third component for industrialization is labor. Obviously, you need people to work in your factories, and so we are going to have a large amount of labor. Part of this is a result of people moving off of the farms after the Civil War, looking for a different life. Part of it is due to a large influx of immigrants coming to America, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Northern and Western Europe, and even from Asia. A fourth component for industrialization is technological advantages or advances. And what we see here is there is going to be a huge number of discoveries, inventions that are going to come about during this time period. As I was saying earlier, some of these came about because of the war. If we look at railroads, for example, railroads were used very limited before the American Civil War, but the war showed people the great advantage of railroads in moving not just people but goods across the country. And so there's going to be a huge amount of railroad building after the war. The war brought about new advances in weaponry, and then we can look at, well, from that weaponry, how can we use these advantages in building a better grade of steel into building better businesses. And so a lot of these technological advances will come about partially because of the war, and then be parlayed into non-war activities after the Civil War. You also need a market or a transportation system. If you're going to have industries, you need a way to get your goods to market. And of course, railroads, as they begin to advance in America, will become that major market transportation system. We will also see advertising coming about during this time period, where businesses began to encourage consumers to buy their goods. Advertising is something that will be very new in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A sixth component that is necessary for industrialization is favorable government policies. In order for business to grow, they have to have favorable government policies, and we will see that this is going to be very much the way things are after the Civil War. There are going to be no corporate taxes. That's going to be a 20th century phenomenon to tax businesses. But we also see pretty much what they call laissez-faire economics. What that means is government staying out of business, allowing business to grow unregulated with no government interference. There are advantages and disadvantages to laissez-faire economics, which we will talk about as the chapter progresses. And then a seventh thing that we see that encourages industrialization is the new business and managerial techniques. Once businesses began to grow from your small mom and pop, one proprietorship owners into large partnerships and then ultimately corporations, you have to have new ways of managing those businesses. And we will see that that begins here in America. We'll begin to see owners being separate from management. You'll have mid-level management, and that encourages new jobs to come about. So we see that all of these 7 factors converge together, beginning really in the 1880s and moving us well into becoming a major industrial player by the time we get to the turn of the century. Some of the new inventions that we see coming about that encourage industrialization and contribute to industrialization. Of course, the first ones, as we keep talking about, is the railroads. The railroads are going to be instrumental in industrialization in the United States because they become the primary method of moving goods across the nation. Railroads, as we were saying earlier, became very useful during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, there became a drive to build more and more railroads. And so we see big railroad entrepreneurs coming about, like the Vanderbilt family. The United States government even authorized and financed the building of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. That first transcontinental railroad was completed, and that brings the East and the West together, greatly shortening the time of the people moving across the United States. Instead of those long wagon trains that took months and months to cross the United States, now you're looking at a couple of weeks maybe, or even days to move from place to place across the United States. After the building of the first transcontinental railroad, we see private individuals getting involved in railroad building and building other transcontinental railroads. And so railroads really began to draw the country together financially, economically, and even on a personal level allows people to move across the United States better. Another major industry or invention was oil. Oil, of course, had been underneath the soil for centuries, really, but we did not have the methods of drawing that oil out. The first oil well came in actually shortly before the Civil War in 1857 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. We had what was called Drake's Folly, where individual began drilling for oil, and everybody kind of made fun of him, Edwin Drake. And when the oil began gushing through, everyone realized that Drake really did know what he was talking about. On this slide, this picture in the background is a picture of oil fields in Pennsylvania in the early oil days of the United States. It's taken in the 1860s, and you can see how much smaller the oil derricks are than what we see today, but you see also the little shanties that the oil field workers are working in. We live in Texas, and so we usually think of Texas being the big oil producer in the country, as it is beginning in the 20th century. But the early oil fields in the United States were actually in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And this is a picture from that era. It will be later in the early 20th century when we began to see oil becoming a major player in Texas. A third major industry that contributes to industrialization is steel. Of course, steel's been around since the Middle Ages. The knights of the round table, as it was, with King Arthur, had steel swords. But steel was very expensive. It took a very long time to make. And so iron was the major player in heavy building materials. Iron has its limits. There's a limit to how much weight it can hold, and of course we know that iron tends to rust and become unstable. As early as the 1850s, once again, an Englishman, Henry Bessemer, perfected the steel process, and so after the Civil War we began to see this massive production of steel. The Bessemer process greatly reduced the time that it took to produce steel, and then therefore made it more efficient. Steel begins to replace iron as the major building foundation for railroads, to build the railroad track. Once we saw its advantages in the use of railroads, then we began to use it and building materials, and steel will allow us to build bigger, stronger bridges, bigger, stronger, taller buildings, and so steel becomes a major player. Then, of course, electricity. People have been doing experiments with electricity going all the way back, of course, to Ben Franklin with his kite experiments. But of course, Thomas Edison is the person who actually perfected the light bulb. Once again, it was an Englishman, Henry Swan, that actually invented a light bulb, but it was not very efficient. And Thomas Edison perfected that, and with that perfecting of that light bulb, then we began to see the building of electrical relay stations and beginning to bring electricity first to businesses and then later to private homes. And then, of course, another major invention of this time period was the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. Telephones, of course, will help in our communications, and anytime you can speed up communications, that, of course, is going to be good for business. So this is just kind of a sampling of some of the major inventions of the time. You can see that it's like one invention leads to the invention of something else, then leads to the invention of something else. And so, of course, by today's standards, those old Alexander Graham Bell telephones that you had to plug into the wall, and you had to have all these telephone lines going from place to place, have totally been replaced with our cell phones. You can barely find even a landline. So once you get the inventions and then you perfect those inventions, and so before you know it, by the time we get to the 20th century, the United States is the major industrial producer of the world. This is just a picture of the joining of the transcontinental railroad lines, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, joining those lines at Provo, Utah. I just thought it was kind of a neat picture to show you. As these new inventions came about, we also began to see new types of business organizations, major corporations. And these major corporations were usually started by private individuals, and oftentimes one individual or a family. And of course, one of the things that we always look at with this rapid industrialization of the United States is these industrialists who put forth these new businesses. And sometimes these industrialists are called robber barons, kind of indicating that they exploited the people, they exploited the country in order to gain their own wealth. Sometimes they are called captains of industry, and those, with the indication that on the backs of these individuals, the United States grew and prospered, and they gave us as a country much more than they took from the country. And that is going to be your discussion question. for this chapter is going to be for your discussion board, looking at were they robber barons or captains of industry, to make up your own mind as you read the chapter and listen to these notes. So I've simply called these the barons of business, so you can decide if they're robber barons or captains of industry for yourself. One of these barons of business that we look at is John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, of course, is usually synonymous with the oil industry because he did help begin the major oil industry in the United States. There were many smaller companies that started out, and but eventually those companies were taken over by John D. Rockefeller and his brother William Rockefeller, who started the Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller sometimes did use unsavory business practices to run his competition out of business. One of the things we do see about Rockefeller is that he did not believe that competition was necessarily a good thing for business. He was a very strong believer in survival of the fittest, and so he believed that if the big corporations ran out the small businesses, then that was so much better for the business. So sometimes he gets a really bad rep because he is seen to be pretty ruthless in his business activities. What we do know about Rockefeller, though, is that he did really help to grow and develop the oil industry in the United States. By the time we get to the late 1870s, Rockefeller has control of about 95% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. And not only does he control the oil refining capacity in the country, he controls the oil wells, the drilling of the oil, the distribution of the oil, and so he really controls the oil industry in the United States. The other thing that we can see, though, that sometimes we look at with Rockefeller is because of the efficiency of Standard Oil Company, the United States was able to surpass all other countries in the production of oil. And under Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller's leadership, the United States became the major oil producer in the world. Another one of these barons of business that we talk about during this time frame is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, of course, is synonymous with the steel industry. Carnegie is a very interesting individual because he was an immigrant to America from Scotland. He came over really as a poor immigrant. His family had lost most of their fortune. They had at one time owned looms making cloth, and they had, been surpassed. Industry had kind of passed them by, and so he and his mother immigrated to the United States, and he started out really as a messenger boy for the railroads, became a telegrapher, and inspired some of his bosses with his great work ethic, and they gave him opportunities to move up in the company, and eventually one of them gave him an opportunity to buy stock in this new business of steel. And before you knew it, Andrew Carnegie was controlling the steel industry. Carnegie Steel became the most efficient producer of steel in the world in the early 20th century. And it was actually outproducing all other countries combined in steel. What Andrew Carnegie did as a steel producer was he quickly saw the advantages of steel, and he began to sell his steel product to the railroads. Steel was more expensive than iron, but he convinced the railroads that you're going to pay this higher upfront cost, but in the long run it's going to save you money because you're not going to have to replace those iron rails as much. And once the railroads began using the steel, Then other building contractors began to look at, well, hey, we could use steel to build bridges, we could use steel to build better buildings, and so the steel industry really took off. Carnegie was always looking for ways to perfect his business, and unlike some of the Gilded Age businessmen, he put most of his money back into his corporation. He still became exceedingly wealthy, making millions of dollars in his lifetime. But one of the things we also know about Andrew Carnegie is that he was also a great philanthropist. Eventually, in around 1900, he will sell Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, who we're going to talk about in just a minute, and he sold it for $1 billion. And then he took much of that money and gave it back to the country. Andrew Carnegie was a believer in something that we call the gospel of wealth. And this was the belief that the wealthy owed something back to society. And so he took most of his fortune and donated it back to the country in the form of building libraries, research institutions like the Carnegie Institute, gave it to the arts. So he is really noted as one of the great philanthropists in the country. J.P. Morgan was a different type of baron of business than Rockefeller and Carnegie, in that he is what we call a finance capitalist. He isn't identified with one industry. He was actually a banker. And through his banking endeavors, he began to invest in many different corporations and different types of businesses. He was involved in banking, in insurance, in the electricity business, and eventually, as we just said, in the steel industry. As I said, he bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie, and it became then known as U.S. Steel, and U.S. Steel Corporation is still around today. Another thing that we see with J.P. Morgan is that he was so diversified in all these various industries like railroads and steel and banking and insurance, that he actually became a member of the board of directors for 112 corporations in the United States. Now that's important to kind of note, because you don't become a member of the board of directors on a corporation by owning a minor amount of stock. So that meant that he controlled major interests in 112 different corporations in the United States. Eventually, he became the wealthiest man in the United States during his lifetime. And to kind of give you an idea of just how much money J.P. Morgan had, in 1893, the United States is going to go into what today we would call a depression. Back then they called it a panic of 1893. And at the time, the United States was on what we call the gold standard, and so people could go to the banks when you're on the gold standard and trade in any paper money for actually metallic money for gold. And this is why they called them panics, because when we would go into one of these depressions, there would be a run on the bank. People would run to the bank and try to trade in all their paper money for actual gold. And there was such a run on the banks in 1893 that the U.S. Treasury was beginning to run short on gold. And so the United States government actually borrowed money from J.P. Morgan's corporations in order to keep the Treasury afloat. So he was an extremely wealthy individual for his time. And one of the things that we see about this time frame and these captains of industry is that there was this concept of the self-made man, probably having a lot to do with Andrew Carnegie, raising himself up by his bootstraps, this poor immigrant that, becomes this super wealthy individual. And sometimes historians have called this the myth of the self-made man, that anybody could make something of himself. It's really not a myth. There were many of these individuals, maybe not to the degree of Carnegie, but who rose up from very poor circumstances and became either extremely wealthy or moderately wealthy during this time period. However, it is also important to note that many of these individuals, like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, came from more wealthy families. Rockefeller kind of from a more middle-class family, but J.P. Morgan came from a banking family. So it's not totally a myth. There were opportunities for hard work and ingenuity and inventiveness to help you become a wealthy individual. But sometimes it also took a little bit of good luck. One of the other things that we see identified with this time period is this concept of social Darwinism. And this is something I want you to kind of keep in mind, because when we start talking about imperialism, we're going to talk about social Darwinism again. This time we're talking about social Darwinism as it relates to business activities. The idea of social Darwinism really took that scientific idea of evolution, of survival of the fittest, that in nature the fittest species survive and the weaker ones are taken over by the strong. And we take that in these individuals, especially Rockefeller. He's a huge supporter of this concept of social Darwinism, believed that in business then it is also justifiable for the big strong businesses to take over the weak smaller businesses. So this is, like today we could say this is kind of the Walmart concept, that unfortunately oftentimes when Walmart comes into a community, some of your smaller mom and pop shops can't compete and they close down. And so Rockefeller would say, well, that's just business, and that's the way it is supposed to be. This concept also justifies the status quo, that the weak should be weak and the strong should be strong, and the rich should be rich and the poor should be poor. But they also say that if you work hard, you can make better your circumstances. And this brings us to this idea of what they called the Protestant work ethic. There was a noted Protestant minister at the time who said that there's not a poor person in America who is not poor because of his own inadequacies, and basically blaming the poor for being poor. That, of course, is not always true. Sometimes people are poor just because of the circumstances that they were born into. But the idea is that you can work to better your circumstances, that you can work to become wealthy, in which we still predominantly as a nation do believe this. One of the bad things about the Protestant work ethic, though, was that in some cases it was taken to the extreme. Sometimes it was taken to the idea that if you were poor, you were out of favor with God. And if you were rich, you were in favor with God. So it almost makes it look like, well, if you're poor, it's because you're a sinner and you've done something wrong. And that, of course, today in the 21st century, most people would not believe that. As we were looking at earlier, another concept of this time is this gospel of wealth that I mentioned in relation to Andrew Carnegie. And many of these wealthy individuals, especially Andrew Carnegie, but even Rockefeller in his older age, did begin to give back to America. They began to build public buildings and institutes for research. Of course, we also have, Rockefeller Center, which is a major cultural center in the United States. And so it was this idea that if you were wealthy, you should also give back to the nation. The things that we often see when we're talking about this rapid industrialization of America is this discussion about the alliance between business and government, the alliance between business and politics. There was much federal and Republican support for business, and as we were saying earlier, the primary idea during this time was laissez-faire economics, was that the government should stay out of economics. The government should not regulate business. That was not the place of government. And it really had always been the practice of the United States government to stay out of business. What begins to change as we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though, is the volume of business that we're doing. We have these large corporations who are producing massive amounts of work, and they have hundreds and thousands of individuals working for them. And sometimes this does lead to corrupt practices. And one of the things that we see that is a negative of this industrialization really is the conditions that the workers had to work in, the very low pay of the workers. And it's important to remember that when you have laissez-faire economics, there is no minimum wage, there are no government standards for factories, for safety, there are no standards that you can only work a certain amount of time in the day. And so we do see that the conditions of workers was often very difficult. And we also see some corrupt business practices, some unethical things being done to run your competition out of business and run the little guy mostly out of business. And those things we see when the government doesn't have any control over business, there's nothing they can do to stop those types of activities. That we also see of this industrialization and these new types of businesses that are going, though, is a new middle class in America. The United States has always had a middle class. Going all the way back to colonial times, we had middle class workers. But at that time, they were mostly your attorneys, some doctors, merchants, your artisans, those people like a Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, people that owned their own shops. That was what was considered the middle class. So they were really kind of businessmen that own, a lot of businessmen that own their own companies, their mom and pop shops, we would call them today. As we move into the industrial age in the late 19th century, now we see a new middle class emerging, people that don't necessarily own their own business. They work for somebody else, but they're working at a higher level than just a straight, what we would think, blue-collar laborer. We have office workers, because when you have these big corporations that are bringing a lot of different factories together, you're going to have a centralized office. So we have office workers. We have salespeople who will start working in these big department stores that are going to emerge, like your Macy's and your Marshall Fields and JCPenney's and things like that. People working in management positions, as we were talking about earlier. As we were saying earlier, one of the negatives of industrialization was the conditions in the factories and the conditions of the workers. The conditions in the factories oftentimes were quite unsafe. People would even say that in some cases they were dangerous. And what we see is there is no regulations for safety. So the factories were built to produce as many goods as possible with very little considerations about the health and safety of the workers. So oftentimes they had poor ventilation, poor lighting. We see that there were no fire escapes in some of them, which is going to cause some accidents, and people get killed because of that. The machinery oftentimes did not have safety equipment on the machinery, and there's a lot of on-the-job accidents where people get killed or maimed. we see that people who lived in American cities at the turn of the century and worked in these factories had very short life expectancies. Only about 40 to 45 years old was their life expectancy because of the carcinogens that they breathed in. Coal was the main source of fuel in most of these factories, and so the cities were very polluted from the coal, and the workers are breathing that in daily. We have a huge increase in industrialization, and so we're going to have a huge increase of industrial workers. People working outside of agriculture in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s increased by about 300%. We moved from a predominantly agricultural country to a predominantly industrial country. The workers were paid very, very low wages. The wages for the average worker were $1.25 to $1.50 per day, not per hour, per day. And the work day lasted anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day. And they usually worked 6 days a week. So you would have 1 day a week off. And so you can see people literally were working themselves to death for very low wages. And that low wage stayed pretty consistent over about a 20 to 25 year period. Women and children often worked in these factories also. It was not just the men. Now we begin to see women and children also working in these factories. And women and children were paid even lower wages. So if a man was paid $1.25 a day, a woman might be paid $1 or 75 cents a day, and children maybe 50 cents a day. Children and women were used a great deal in the textile industries because of the skills that were needed in those industries, and also because women and children had smaller hands that fit the equipment in the textile industries better. You can imagine that with conditions being this difficult, by the time we get to the early 20th century and even the late 19th century, there begins to be workers' organizations. The struggle begins to unionize. It's going to take a long time for unions to gain any respect in America or any power, but we do have some early unions that we're going to talk about on the next slide. Two things that the unions worked for, no matter which union you're talking about, is they worked for an 8-hour workday. The concept was that an 8-hour workday would be safer for workers because a lot of the on-the-job accidents were brought on by fatigue. When you get into working 12 or 14 hours a day, you just get fatigued, and so they said 8-hour workdays would be safer for workers. What that also means, though, as we know today, if you have people that work on an hourly basis, is if you work over 8 hours a day, you get paid overtime. Today, that's usually time and a half. It doesn't mean that you necessarily work only 8 hours, but if you work longer than 8 hours, you get paid more for that work. Another concept that all the unions will be working toward is collective bargaining. This is the concept that workers have the right to go to management and make demands for higher pay, demands for safer working conditions without the threat of being fired. This is something that we really take for granted today, collective bargaining. But in the early industrial age in America, if workers complained, they were fired because with the huge influx of immigrants that are coming to America and the many people that are moving off of the farms, there was not a shortage of workers. So the idea of management in the factories was, well, if you don't like it here, then you don't have to work here. So if you complained about working conditions, you would just be fired. A couple of the early unions that I do want to talk about in just a little bit of detail are the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. The Knights of Labor was actually one of our first major unions in America. It actually began around 1869, but it really didn't gain a lot of prominence until the late 1870s. And part of the reason I think that it kind of took off in the 1870s is because by that time industrialization was becoming more and more prevalent in the United States. And one of the things that set the Knights of Labor apart from other unions that came about the same time and later is that it welcomed all labor. Today, we kind of look at labor unions where you have United Steel Workers, United Postal Workers, United Automotive Workers, so that the unions kind of segregate themselves by the jobs. The Knights of Labor welcomed all laborers, regardless of what industry that they worked in. Another thing that we see that was very unique until well in the 20th century is the Knights of Labor allowed women to join their unions. That was very uncommon to allow women to join the unions. And so by the late 1870s, there were about 700,000 members to the Knights of Labor. One of the things that brings the downfall of the Knights of Labor, though, is a strike that they become involved in the 1880s. It's a strike against the McCormick Harvester Company, one of these big tractor companies that was building tractors, McCormick Harvester. The company was stationed in Chicago, and the workers went on strike against the company for the regular things: higher wages, safer working conditions. And one of the things that we see that was very common during this age was when labor would go on strike, they would hold these big rallies like in a park or somewhere, because there's no TV, and kind of, you know, a way to get their message across about what they're striking about. They would hold these big rallies, and people would come and listen to them give speeches and talk about, you know, what they were demanding and why they were demanding it. Well, the rally for this strike was held in a park in Chicago called Haymarket Square. Well, during the rally, some individuals who were not members of the union, they were anarchists, and anarchists don't believe in government. Some anarchists came and they threw bombs during the rally. Because of the bomb throwing, several individuals and several police officers were killed. And so, unfortunately, what happened that had a negative impact on the union was the way the activities are projected in the media is it makes it look like the individuals, these anarchists that threw these bombs, that caused these deaths, were members of the union. They were not members of the union. And so we begin to see that the union is identified with the violence and the deaths that occur. And so people begin to distance themselves from the Knights of Labor. And we see a very rapid reduction in membership of the Knights of Labor, so much so that by 1890, the Knights of Labor basically almost doesn't exist. Another major labor union that came about around the same time, just a little bit later than the Knights of Labor, is the American Federation of Labor, which is, of course, the AFL. The AFL, of course, is still around today. One of the major founders of the AFL union is Samuel Gompers. One of the big goals of the AFL was what we call the closed shop. A closed shop is something we don't have here in Texas because we are what we call a right-to-work state. But in a closed shop, in order to work in a factory, all workers would be forced to join a union. The reason for this, for the union, of course, is that if everybody in the factory is a member of the union and the union calls a strike, then everybody's going to go on strike, and the strike is going to be more successful. In right-to-work states like Texas and many other southern states, we say that that's unfair to make people join a union in order to get a job. Because you see, to join a union is not free. You have to pay union dues every month. And so the closed shop was the big goal of the AFL unions, and they were successful in some northern states in getting that accomplished. The AFL, though, in its early years had a lot of struggles. They were involved in a couple of big strikes in the country. One of these was the Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike was against the Homestead Steel Plant, which was part of Carnegie Steel Corporation. Henry Frick, who was the manager of the Homestead Strike, manager of the Homestead Plant, decided that he was going to cut the wages of the workers at the plant. The workers obviously don't believe that they get paid enough as it is, so cutting the workers' wages caused a strike to occur. And in the midst of the strike, once again, we have those crazy anarchists that don't believe in government at all, stirring up trouble. In the midst of the strike, a bomb was thrown at Henry Frick's house. Fortunately, it only landed on the porch, and neither he nor his family were injured. But once again, we see violence being associated with labor unions and some of the positive support that the workers had been getting before the bomb throwing incident began to dwindle. During the Homestead Strike, what happens is eventually the workers, after 4 months of being on strike and not receiving pay, the workers ended up going back to work at the Homestead plant at the lower wages that Henry Frick had instituted for them. We see this really kind of becomes the major way that corporations deal with the early unions and the early union strikes, is they figure they have more money than the unions, and so they can wait out the union, and it works. The unions usually have small strike funds that they can use to help support the workers, for a number of weeks. But if you have a strike going into 4 or 5 months, the union strike fund is going to run out of money, and eventually the workers are going to have to go back to work. And that becomes one of the reasons that the early unions were usually not successful in their strikes. They did not have enough money, and the corporations would just wait them out. Another major union at this time that actually was part of the AFL was the United Railroad Workers Union, and the leader of the United Railroad Workers Union was Eugene Debs. And the United Railroad Workers Union is going to go on strike in the early 1890s against the Pullman Company. The Pullman Company made these very extravagant railroad cars. They were often referred to as the Pullman Palace cars. A lot of the wealthy individuals owned their own railroad car. They didn't want to travel with the regular folks. And so the Pullman Company began to have some struggles in 1893 when the country is in that depression. And so they decided that they were going to cut the workers' wages because they could not pay them the wages, because people can't buy their Pullman Palace cars during the Depression. Well, the workers at first said that that would be fine because they would rather have some pay than no pay by being just completely laid off. But the Pullman Company was one of these companies that had what we called a company town. In order to work for the Pullman Company, you had to live in the company town. And the company owned all the housing, they owned the general store, everything. So basically, everything you got in pay went back to the company in form of rent or buying things at the general store. So the workers said, yes, we will take the reduction in pay, but we would also like a reduction in the rents. And the Pullman Company said no. So the workers went on strike. Well, it begins to be a huge strike because the Pullman workers were part of the United Railroad Workers. And so to show support for the Pullman workers, all of the United Railroad Workers across the country go on strike against the Pullman Company. And what this means is all of these railroad workers refused to work on any trains that had Pullman cars. So if you were an engineer, if you were the guy that shoveled coal in the engine, if you were the bellman that took the tickets, all of these workers said, if it has a Pullman car on it, we are not going to work on these trains. And so the Pullman strike actually created a major national crisis because it halted railroad movement in the country for a time. Because the railroads were so instrumental to the movement of goods in the country, the federal courts will actually intervene in the Pullman strike, and one of the federal circuit courts is going to order the Pullman workers to go back to work. They issued an injunction ordering them to go back to work. Eugene Debs refused to adhere to that injunction and tried to keep the strike going, and so he was actually arrested. Once Debs was arrested and put in jail for violating this federal injunction, the strike eventually fell apart. But we see early on the labor union is going to have struggles because they're associated with violence. They usually don't have enough money to actually fight big business. And oftentimes we even see that the government intervenes on behalf of business, and that hurts the strikes that they have. What we see by the time we get to the early 20th century, that the United States has industrialized at such a rate that we are producing 1/3 of the entire world's goods. This young, new little country that's 150 years old is now producing 1/3 of the world's goods. We have an urban industrial revolution. We have become an urban industrialized country. We have moved away from our agrarian roots, and where agriculture and large plantation owners used to basically control the government, now we're looking at industrial leaders and these large corporations controlling the government more. We have moved from small single proprietorship businesses to large corporations, often multi-millionaire corporations that control entire industries like the oil industry. Okay, and that concludes our discussion for Chapter 16, Big Business and Organized Labor. Our next chapter is going to be Chapter 18 because it feeds into Chapter 16, and then we will go back and pick up Chapter 17.